Okay, here is the sample read for essay one, market period one essay. So when you're looking at your rubric, you want to take note of the numbers. So here we're just looking at the first section. So just so we're clear, these numbers are deductions. So I start at 100 and then I deduct. So in this scenario here, the student has 3 2s. So that's 6 at this particular point. They're at a 94. And then I'll do these deductions here. When you're to the right of the rubric, that's a 0. And then as you move to the left, that's where the negatives are. As you notice, -2, -4, and so on. That's how you're going to use the sheet to determine your grade and determine where you're, where you need to practice for the next essay. All right, so when we're looking again at the sources, for the most part, this is where most errors were located. Students not having enough sources that clearly support the thesis. I'm looking at your thesis first, and then I'm asking the question, does the source cited support the thesis? And that's what this is suggesting here. If I have to make a determination about how this source links up to this thesis and supports it, it's questionable. That would put you right here. So right here, it's questionable. I'm trying to make a determination. I might go here, or I might actually go to the entire 4. Analysis of source. For this part, you want to think about the question how or why does this source that you identified supports the thesis. That's your explanation. This is your evidence right here. If you're lost on what that means, you want to take a look at the screencast here, how and why essay. Coming down here, we see some additional deductions. All right, so this is the essay read that I thought was, um, a good example here. So they're looking at Henry Ford and production. In the 1910, 1920s, Henry Ford lowered the cost of producing cars by utilizing the assembly line, cheap interchangeable parts, and producing their own car parts rather than purchasing from another seller. So what they're trying to prove here is that Henry Ford was able to lower the cost of production by doing these items here. Now, for this enumerated thesis, it looks like they are arguing 3 points, 2 and 3. We should use one paragraph for each. This will be paragraph 2, 3, 4, but that was not the requirement for essay number 1. We were just looking for one paragraph. So for this student's submission, they could have just focused on this section here, or this section, or this item. Seems like they've chosen to address all 3. So let's kind of move on here. So I have this question, HW, how and why. Henry Ford created the Ford Motor Company in the 1900s. Ford was focused on producing top quality cars that anyone could afford. His goal was to drive the cost of manufacturing down and therefore increase overall production. So this section right here is significant because it is addressing this point here, and they are giving you some sort of historic context. Some students made the mistake of giving me their thesis and then going straight into a source. My question would then be, well, there's no historic context. If you see an X, that means that there's no historic context that is provided. So the reader is kind of left with this disconnect from the thesis to the first source. So this section right here, you think about it like your topic sentence, a couple sentences maybe that are providing the historic context. But this is going to vary depending on the situation. His goal was to drive the costs of manufacturing. One way he did this was through the use of interchangeable parts within the manufacturing process. So this area right here, I know is historically accurate. There should be evidence on that. Ken Adler mentions in his article, Invasion and Amnesia and Engineering Rationale. So they're giving me the author's name as well as the source. Notice how they used italics. Some students chose to use quotes here, but then what do you do when you have quotes here? Like, you don't want to have quotes to identify the source and then quotes for the section that you're referencing. So one way around it is exactly what the student did here. They used italics for the source, and that allows them to use quotations for the reference there. In his Ford scheme, interchangeability of parts allowed low-skill wage laborers to assemble a prodigious number of Model Ts at low unit cost. So what they're looking at here is this point, interchangeable parts, which we see here in their thesis, and the source is addressing the point that it led to low cost. So I put down here nice. Um, Ford Motor Company began turning to the use of interchangeable parts. So my comment here is transition, T. I would like to have seen a better transition from this source to the next sentence. These are essentially parts that were standardized that could be used in a variety of ways. As a result, Ford would not have to spend money on manufacturing brass parts, instead use a cheap one that was able to fulfill many roles. So right there is a historic point. My question, how does this link to the thesis? Low-skilled work using low-cost parts directly reduce the cost of production. Well, how exactly did that occur? And so that's kind of the point that I'm making here, where I'm going back to the thesis with that line or that arrow. Now they get into another transition. So here, I probably would like to have seen a little bit more of an analysis making that point. Let's see where they go with the second one. According to Carl Williams and Ford versus Fordism, top iron, top hood, coil sets were brought in-house, and during this period, 16 cost per truck was estimated 54% of their purchase price by way of kind of the wheel set, carburetor, shows a purchase price reduction. So in this particular source, kind of links with what they're addressing here, which is the whole point about interchangeable parts. The interchangeable parts, as well as the ability to produce them in-house, leads to a reduction of cost. So what's happening here is, let's use the example of, I don't know, $600 it costs to make the car, but by using the interchangeable parts, that brings down your cost per unit to maybe $500, or let's go 580. And now you throw in that you're producing your own parts. Oh, we'll put own parts. So maybe that reduces the cost another 30. So now we're at 550. So this student, just based on some of the sources and some of the writing, the points that they've made already, they did the research and they seem to have an understanding of what this topic is about. Around this time period, not too fond of that, but Ford began building new facilities, each hyper-focused on manufacturing as many cars as possible. The new facilities will manufacture their own cars, part on a large scale. This contrasts Ford's practice of outsourcing, where they would purchase car parts from an external. So this is key because, again, it goes back to producing internal. They're not relying on external suppliers. They're using internal our workers to produce the parts internally, which is going to ultimately drive down the cost of the vehicle. And so right there, that section is significant. As a statistic highlight, shift of in-house producing produce their own parts compared to out yielded a larger reduction in cost. The result of this is a lower price of production. The result of this. So I'm not too fond of the use of the word this. There's a lower price of production. Additionally, Henry Ford's use of the assembly line greatly improved production and reduced costs. So right there, you probably want to think about, okay, well, how? How exactly did that occur? How and why? Let's see where they go, though. Maybe they address this. Ford. So again, the source, the base for the electric part is placed precisely in the conveyor in one place. If it is placed otherwise, an extra operation handling that. The ideas follow also in the Ford engine leads to a savings in handling and ultimately in cost. So again, their source is addressing this point about costs coming down, and I can see a direct link. In this particular source, they're talking about bringing costs down. This one, it shows a reduction, and then up here, low unit cost. So those three parts are addressing the thesis here. There's a direct connection. Remember, they're trying to say that Ford was able to lower the cost of producing cars. Their sources address that particular point, especially that section that I just highlighted, low unit cost, this section, purchase price reduction, and so on. Reasoning behind the assembly line was eliminate unnecessary movements and increase. So for this section, it seems like they're going into Taylorism. I'd like to see a better transition here, providing some historic context. We don't want to use this particular point reinforcing the quote. Assembly line was utilized in a particular way to avoid movements or handling. This is technical, and this is what the prompt was about. The prompt was about scientific management, Taylorism, Fordism, and so the language that's used in this section, again, shows that the student has an understanding of the prompt. As a result, they will work fast, produce more cars in a shorter amount of time, leading to, so I would have liked to have seen some section here that goes back to the point that's made in the thesis, that they're addressing that led to a reduction of cost per unit, and then ultimately that is going to lead to a situation where they're going to be selling more cars because the cars are going to be produced cheaper. What I spent comparing left time resources money to produce the same amount of cards they would prior to the implementation of the assembly line. This will reduce costs drastically. So the sources here, not bad. And one thing that I want to address here is this section lacks a clear unified message. In this particular sample, the student seems to be going back to the thesis point at least 2 times, where they're trying to address in their analysis that the cost of the cars went down, and that's what I'm looking for. So hopefully this helps.